Okay, welcome back again. We are going to continue with another topic that is also important, but this one is not as practical as the previous one with the triangular arbitrage. This one is the beginning of what we are going to start learning from now on, which is more than only transferring currencies between countries. Now we are going to also consider time, because previously we only focus on space, like moving between countries. That's actually the triangular arbitrage. Everything happens in the same moment, but it's in between different countries. But now we're going to change that perspective, and we are going to include also time. So for this, I'm going to use the presentation that is on Blackboard. This is presentation number 4. It's called International Parity Conditions, and here we are going to analyze what are the main forces that affect exchange rate apart from supply and demand, which is what we learned in the first partial. So the first slide of the presentation is actually a story. So what I'm going to do is to use the whiteboard, because I want to talk about a story that might be interesting, and then it will be easier for you to understand what's happening between exchange rates if we include time. So for this story, I want you to imagine that we live in the border between Mexico and the US. So here is Mexico, here is the US, right? So we live just in the border. And one thing is that we can freely cross between the US and Mexico. So we can move between the US and Mexico. We actually live like 1 block away from the border. So for us, it's the same if we stay in the US or if we stay in Mexico. Then the next thing that we need to consider is that we don't have to pay anything to move between the US and Mexico. So it's pretty easy to move between the two countries. And now, let's assume also that the exchange rate between the dollar and the peso, this is an assumption, is 1 peso per dollar. That's the price. That's just an assumption. And continuing with the story, let's imagine that there is a hamburger that we really like. And this hamburger is being sold in the US, but also in Mexico. This is my burger, and in Mexico, we also have the same burger. It's the same burger, it tastes the same, it's the same size, the same quality, everything is the same. And in the US, the price of this burger is $1, and the price in Mexico is 1 peso. So if this is what's happening between the US and Mexico, and this is the case of the burger, and these are the prices, and this is the exchange rate, we really don't care where we buy the burger, right? We can buy it in the US or in Mexico, it's the same. We only exchange 1 peso to dollar, and we get the burger in the US, or we use our peso in Mexico, and we get the burger in Mexico. So for us, it's the same thing. And that is, I don't know, this is happening in December of 2019. But imagine that in the next year, there are a lot of things that happen in Mexico, like maybe something wrong with the government. There are, I don't know, like a hurricane, an earthquake that affects the economy in Mexico, and it makes it more expensive to cook the burger. So instead of 1 peso, the price of the burger changes to 2 pesos. So if I buy the burger in Mexico, I will have to pay 2 pesos. But if I buy the burger in the US, I will have to pay $1. So where would you like to buy the burger? Of course, in the US, right? Because it's cheaper. With the price of 1 burger in Mexico, you can get 2 burgers in the US. So because of that, a lot of people will move from Mexico to buy burgers in the US. And what does that mean? I think we can go back to the first session or second session of the course, when we learned that if the demand for a currency increases, its price is going to increase, right? There is more demand for dollars because people want cheaper burgers. So what will happen is that the price of the dollar will increase from 1 until what price do you think will be fair or it will be like balanced? Well, 2, right? At 2 pesos per dollar, again, it doesn't matter if you buy your burger in Mexico or in the US. So with this example, what I'm trying to prove is that inflation is a variable that affects the price of the exchange rate, isn't it? Because if things are more expensive in your own country, then you will aim to buy things from another country with cheaper prices, and then you will be demanding more currency from the other country, and it will and that currency will get more expensive. So let me go back to the presentation because I think with this, our example is over, so I hope you understand this short story. Let me now share the presentation. Should be here. So after the story, I have an important question to ask. Is it possible that the Mexican peso be 1-to-1 with the dollar? Well, the answer is no, it's not possible. Well, it can be possible only if the prices in Mexico increase less than in the US, and that will need a lot of time for that to happen. And also, I think it's not a rule because the Mexican economy has more inflation than the American economy. So the answer is not really, only if the inflation in Mexico is lower than inflation in the US, which in real life is not possible. And there are economic theories that try to understand the changes in exchange rates and then link them to price levels, in this case, inflation and also interest rates. That's what we're going to learn in the next video. We call to these theories international parity conditions theories. That's why the name of the presentation is International Parity Conditions. And we are going to study this because this is the core of everything on international finance. If we want to predict what's going to happen with our investment in another country, if we want to predict the income that we are going to get from a subsidiary in another country, we need to be aware of all of these theories. So this theory that I just explained, because it's actually explaining the theory just with an example, with a story, is called the law of one price. This is what you have in your presentation. Law of one price is the name of this theory. This theory says that if the price of a good increases in a country, then it's going to affect the exchange rate, and that country which has higher prices will tend to lose value. It will depreciate. That's what's happening with Mexico. In the case of Mexico, in that example, the burger became more expensive and people didn't buy it in Mexico. They preferred to buy it in the US, demanding more dollars and then making the dollar more expensive. But this theory has 3 assumptions that don't work in real life. These 3 assumptions are, they're here in the presentation. The first one is that the same good is being sold in 2 different markets. So it has to be exactly the same good. In that example, I said that it was a burger, it was the same burger, same taste, same quality, blah, blah, same size. So it has to be exactly the same product being sold in 2 different markets. Then the next one is that there are no restrictions on the sale. So anyone can buy it and there are no taxes. If you're a foreigner, there are no custom fees, anything like that. So there are no restrictions on buying or selling the product. And finally, transportation costs of moving the product are minimum or 0. So you can buy the burger and eat it in the US or bring it home. It's okay because it's only one block away. So that example kind of works for what we were just talking about. It's in the law of one price. You need to take into consideration these 3 assumptions. If you get these 3 assumptions correct, you can use this theory. But of course, in real life, this is not always true. We are going to learn about this, what is like the next theory after this, but you need to know the core theory. Because in core, it is true. If there is inflation, the the value of that currency is going to depreciate. Even though it's not the best to predict any price or any exchange rate, it's still true that it will depreciate. So if we continue with, before I move to the next slide, let's think about one example, like a real life example, where we can say that the three assumptions are more or less accomplished. So if I gave you a hint in the story because I told you that the good was a burger, right? So in the 70s, some people from a British newspaper called Economist realized that the Big Mac burger had more or less these three assumptions on a tick, like they checked on these three assumptions, because the Big Mac is practically the same burger anywhere in the world, right? If you buy it in Argentina or in Switzerland or in Mexico or in the US or in China, it's the same burger, it's the same ingredients, it tastes almost the same. Second thing, there are almost no restrictions on buying a burger. You can buy a burger anywhere you are, like you don't need to have special permission to buy a Big Mac. So we can say that more or less it's a tick. And also people from the economy say that in McDonald's, if you divide all the transportation costs from McDonald's by the number of Big Macs that they sell in the world, the number that you get is less than 1 cent. So transportation costs for McDonald's are almost zero. So from their perspective, they say that you also have a check in there. So what we are going to do in the next video is to use prices of different goods to calculate a theoretical exchange rate. And we are going to see if the theoretical exchange rate is similar or different to the real exchange rate. That's what we are going to do in the next video. And then we are going to practice in one activity with real life data. So the next video, we will do some practice.